Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with great recent recordings of the classics for the new millennium, recordings that are as wonderful as the great historical ones that everybody's always blabbing about. Yeah, these are really, really good. I'm not kidding. And today we're talking about this little gem, Janacek, his Sinfonietta and Glagolitic Mass, two of his very, very greatest late masterpieces, conveniently coupled on a single disc, as they often are. This is not totally unique, but the performances, wow, baby. They feature the Warsaw Philharmonic, the Warsaw Philharmonic Choir, and soloists, and an organist under Antoni, who we've already talked about in connection with Mahler's Eighth Symphony, one of the great conductors when it comes to large works for chorus and orchestra. He really, really nails them, but also in orchestral music more generally. He's done some fabulous work there too. And this is primus inter pares, first among equals, as they say. Absolutely extraordinary and marvelous. And it really is a wonderful indication of the gradual acceptance of Janacek into the musical mainstream. Because back in the day, and you can see this process in the discography, it's really quite wonderful to watch it happen. Janacek was the province of Czech conductors specifically. Most of the recordings of his music were on Superphone, from the mono ones of people like, Branislav Bakala or Chalabala or people like that, and Václav Talich, up into Karel Anschel, who recorded all of this music spectacularly. The Sinfonietta, Taras Bulba, and the Glagolitic Mass. And those were like the three big works that usually got recorded. There were some other smaller things. Since then, much more has popped up. Then after Anschel, we had Raphael Kubelik. And because Kubelik was in exile, he was living in the West, he brought Janacek with the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra principally, but also he did some other things as well for EMI and whatnot. But he brought Janacek to a much larger Western audience on Deutsche Grammophon. But in those days, when he was making those recordings, Deutsche Grammophon still was just becoming an international label. Kubelik was well known, but not their biggest. He was not Karajan. He wasn't someone they were like plugging like crazy. And so those Janacek recordings were rarities. And I vividly remember back when I was in college, it was 1979, 1980, somewhere in there. And I was at good old Record Masters in Baltimore when I was at Johns Hopkins University, looking through, and I saw these strange-looking albums, especially the one that had the Sinfonietta and Taras Bulba. And I was like, who the hell is Janacek? What the heck is that? And they didn't have samples that you could listen to. I had no idea, but it was Kubelik, who I knew. And, I knew who he was. And I bought it on a whim. And I went home and I put on the Sinfonietta, and the first thing you hear is 14 trumpets, 12 actually in the fanfares or so, or 11 or 9 in the fanfare, and 2 bass trumpets, and then 3 others in the orchestra, just trumpets everywhere, blasting away. And I thought to myself, holy crap, that's Emerson, Lake and Palmer. That's Knife Edge. And sure enough, it was. Emerson, Lake and Palmer borrowed that opening fanfare for their song Knife Edge. But that's, they were wonderful for getting to know classical music, actually. And I listened to the whole piece, and it was extraordinary. It sounded so bizarre. I mean, a totally different musical voice, but thrilling and exciting and wonderful. And then there was Taras Bulba with the bells and the organ and the harps going, just sounds that you never heard before in an orchestral context. So, of course, then I was hooked, and I went and grabbed all the other Janacek I could get my hands on, including Firkuzny doing the piano works, sometimes some with Kubelik and some solo. And, of course, the Glagolitic Mass, which is a mass in Old Church Slavonic that is as unliturgical as any piece of music you'll ever hear in your life. When Janacek, told one critic who said it was an old man's, return to faith. And he looked at the guy, and he was in his 70s when he wrote it, and he said, "I'm not old and I'm not a believer. Ha! Take that." But the music is a glorious setting of this sort of, pantheistic belief in spiritual something. It blows you away. Absolutely blows you away. But it was these Angelo recordings on Superphone that really got us into that music, if you could find them. Then they came out on CD. And then, of course, Charles Mackerras popped up, doing all the operas and recording this music as well, and then discovering original versions of the scores and tinkering and monkeying and, doing all this kind of stuff. And he recorded these pieces as well, marvelously, but with Czech forces. Largely, the only work that sort of burst out of the Czech ghetto. Well, these two works did burst out of the Czech ghetto. The Sinfonietta had always been performed. I mean, Klemperer made it one of his sort of it was one of his calling cards, although he never recorded it formally. And there were earlier recordings by people like Ozawa and various recordings, and Mackerras, of course. I mean, they didn't circulate widely. They really didn't. But they started to bust out of the ghetto, as I said, in the 80s and 90s, probably the 90s more than anything else. And so for the past 20 or 30 years, they've become repertory standards, which is remarkable because the Sinfonietta, which George Sell recorded not very well, I might add, requires, like I said, nine extra trumpets and bass trumpets and tenor tubas. And, it's not a cheap thing to do. You can reduce the number of trumpets as Dochnani did whenever he played it, and I think Sell did too, actually, but you shouldn't. Okay, they're doubling parts, but you need the massed sound of the brass. Anyway, that's a whole nother issue. It's wonderful to see that Janacek has now arrived. And he has, and he's arrived on recording. So these performances from 2011, which sounds stupendous and which are fabulously sung and played and exciting as hell and really well recorded, are part of this normalization of Janacek as part of our one of our regular companions in the concert hall, which is only a good thing because his music is extraordinary. And if you want to hear fabulous modern performances, well, from 2011, here they are. You can get this one and the other disc, which has the Lachian dances and Taras Bulba and some other stuff. But there are also very fine Janacek performances now on Chandos from Edward Gardner, which we will be talking about as well in this series, because they also deserve a shout out as some really fine recent Janacek that's performed in an idiomatic way, exciting, powerful, abrupt, a bit rough. You can't fit the square peg into the round hole, as some of those earlier Janacek performances tried to. Here's the real deal. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.